You feel very warm inside as you hold your partner. You are deeply in love, so much so that you travel back and forth between New Zealand and South Africa. You truly feel like you found your true love. So you tune into his fight and root for the love of your life. He had a fantastic victory, and you couldn't be more happy for him. But your happiness quickly turns into anger when you see his post-fight antics with his coach. He kisses his coach with passion and happiness, so you leave him a mountain's worth of text messages, ending the once beloved relationship. You hop on social media and threaten to fight him. Ever since that day, you've wanted to punish him for breaking your heart, and this weekend you will be able to do just that. You are Israel Adesanya, and this is the Casuals Guide to Israel Adesanya versus Dricus Du Plessis. Starting off the Casuals Guide, we will be looking into the career of current UFC champion Dricus Stillknocks Du Plessis. Dricus was born and raised in Pretoria, South Africa. He trains at an up-and-coming gym, Team CIT. They have a few great fighters currently on the come-up. Dricus is just entering his physical prime, being 30 years old, and he's listed at 6 feet tall. But he makes up for being a little bit short for the middleweight division with his strength and his stockiness. Dricus is one of many fighters who have never had an amateur fight, making his first fight a professional one. And he would make that debut in July of 2013 in the promotion Extreme Fighting Championship, facing off with Shenagu Makwebo. Dricus would show out in spectacular fashion, getting the knockout just 1 minute into the very first round. After that great debut, he would fight again in September of that same year, and he would face off with Bruno Makulu. Dricus was hyped up and would get the rear naked choke finish just 2 minutes into the very first round. Dricus was ecstatic and was ready for his next fight the second this one was over. In less than a month, Dricus would fight Johannes Lamprench. This fight would not go as easily as his previous 2 fights, but Dricus had too much momentum to be stopped, and he would get his third finish in a row in the third round after sinking in another rear naked choke. Dricus was slowly becoming one of the best fighters in South Africa. He just needed to get more fights underneath his belt. So Dricus would fight a few months later in February of 2014. He would fight Donovan Hockey. Dricus would start 2014 with a bang by knocking Hockey out cold in the first round. Dricus was on a roll and had all the confidence a fighter could have. So in August of that same year, he would fight a future UFC fighter who also fought Paulo Costa, Gareth McClellan. But this would be where Dricus' career would take a bump, because Dricus would get caught with the guillotine choke after a very hard-fought 2 rounds. This is when the UFC would sign McClellan, and if Dricus would have won, we might have seen a 5-0 Dricus fight in the UFC years before he eventually would. After taking the first loss in his career, Dricus would fight again in February of 2015 and get right back on track in his matchup with Darren Daniel. Dricus would sink in yet another rear naked choke in the first round. A few months later, in June of that same year, he would fight again, this time fighting Dino Begatin. Dricus would continue his finishing streak by sinking in another rear naked choke and getting the tap in the second round. Dricus was regaining the momentum he had before his loss, and he would have a rematch with Bruno Makulu in December of 2015. Unlike the last time they fought, this would not get finished in the first round, but it would get finished in the second, and Dricus would sink in his infamous rear naked choke and get the tap 3 minutes into the second round. After finishing his third fight in 2015 and regaining the momentum, he would fight again in June of 2016. This time, it was a title shot. He would attempt to dethrone Martin Van Staden. This would be a tough fight, but Dricus never gives up. He would eventually sink in a guillotine choke 4 minutes into the last round. Dricus was riding higher than ever after winning his first belt. Dricus would move up to light heavyweight in December of 2016 when he would fight Rafal Heretic. This would be a walk in the park for Dricus because he would sink in another guillotine choke in the second round. Dricus would fight again in May of 2017 when he would face off with Jose Mauricio de Rocha Jr. And this would be an even easier fight because Dricus would knock him out just 3 minutes into the first round. This would be enough for Dricus to fight for the light heavyweight belt, facing off with EFC champion Yannick Bati. This would be a fantastic fight for Dricus because he would sink in a guillotine choke in the very first round just 1 minute in. Dricus had won his second belt in 2 different weight classes. Feeling like he cleared out the competition in EFC, he would switch promotions to KSW and fight for the middleweight belt once again, this time fighting a German fighter, Roberto Soldic. And Dricus would not disappoint because he would knock out Soldic in the second round just 1 minute in, achieving his 3rd belt. So in October of 2018, Dricus would have an immediate rematch with Soldic, but this match would go much different than his previous fight with him. Dricus would get knocked out in the 3rd round, losing his belt. This would be his 2nd loss, but he was still confident and would learn to not be as reckless as he was in his previous fights. Dricus would take a year off and fight again in September of 2019, going up against Leuten Lauterbach, and this time Dricus would knock out his opponent in the 2nd round. Dricus was finally back in the win column. Dricus would waste no time to fight again. He would fight in December of 2019 against Brandon Lesser, and once again, he would get the finish in the 1st round with the guillotine choke. This one would be enough to get the attention of the biggest MMA promotion in the world, the UFC. And in October of 2020, he would make his highly anticipated UFC debut against Marcus Perez. And in classic Dricus fashion, he would get the knockout just 3 minutes into the 1st round. Dricus was on cloud 9 after winning his debut in the fashion that he did, so he would walk into his 2nd fight in the UFC with the utmost confidence. And in July of 2021, he would fight Trevin Giles. Giles lasted longer than most thought, but the inevitable would end up happening when Dricus knocked out Giles in the 2nd round. After back-to-back knockouts in the UFC, he would get a push in competition, and in July of 2022, he would face off with a former Adesanya opponent, Brad Tavares. This would be a huge test for Dricus and would show the fans his cardio and strong mindset when he would go all 3 rounds with Tavares, and he ended up winning by unanimous decision. This was a huge win for Dricus, and the UFC saw the hype building, so they would match him up with a fan favorite and star in the promotion, Darren Till. This fight was a tough fight on paper, but Darren had fallen from the athlete he once was, and Dricus would put the nail in the coffin by face cranking the daylights out of Darren in the 3rd round. The hype from the fans was building at an alarming rate, but there were still many questions. Sure, Dricus was very strong and very tough, but he had mostly fought only strikers, so the UFC would match him up with a good wrestler in March of 2013, that fight being Derek Brunson. Dricus would put on a devastating beating on Brunson, so much so that Brunson's corner would throw in the towel. This was yet another huge win for Dricus, and he would get matched up with his toughest opponent on paper, getting set up with former champion and fan favorite Robert the Reaper Whittaker. Everyone thought Dricus was going to get exposed, but Dricus would shock the world by knocking Whittaker out cold in the 2nd round. Dricus was on a roll and was in line for a title shot. Another man shocked the world around this time. Sean Strickland dethroned the middleweight king Israel Adesanya, so the unlikely fight would happen. Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis for the middleweight belt, and this fight had a ton of hype, and it would not disappoint. This was a back and forth scrap that left both men bleeding and hurt. Also, it would go all 5 rounds, and Dricus would shock the world and bring the middleweight belt back to Pretoria, South Africa. And that brings us to this weekend, the highly anticipated and most hyped up fight of Dricus' career. And answer the question, who is the true African champion? Israel Adesanya or Dricus Du Plessis? Dricus has 21 wins with only 2 losses. He has 9 knockouts, 10 submissions, and 2 decision wins. He has lost 1 fight by knockout and 1 fight by submission, so he has a 90% finishing rate, which is insane for a champion. Dricus is also undefeated in the UFC, meaning he is not an easy fight for anybody. Now it is finally time to take a look into the rise and fall, as well as the potential rise again of Israel Adesanya, also known as Izzy, and the last style bender. Israel was born in Nigeria, but he was raised in Auckland, New Zealand. He stands very tall for middleweight, being 6'4", and is at the latter end of his physical prime, with him being 35 years old. He also trains at one of the best gyms, City Kickboxing, in New Zealand. Israel had a very long and successful combat sports career. I'll quickly go over his stats in boxing and kickboxing, and we will focus on his MMA career because it is the focus of the video. He has 6 boxing fights, 5 wins and 1 loss. He has had 80 kickboxing fights, 75 wins, 5 losses, with 29 knockout wins. Now, let's rewind to the beginning of his MMA journey. Israel had his one and only amateur fight in November of 2009, which Izzy lost by unanimous decision. So he decided to go back to kickboxing and boxing. Fast forward to 2012, he would attempt again, this time jumping into the professionals. His pro MMA debut was against James Griffiths. Izzy would dominate this fight, knocking out his opponent just 2 minutes into the first round. Needless to say, Israel was riding high and wanted to get another fight in. In June of 2013, he would make his second walk into the octagon, this time fighting John Fake. And once again, Israel would steamroll his opponent, knocking him out just 4 minutes into the first round. Israel would take a year off and fight again in August of 2015, going up against a future UFC fighter, Kenan Song. And Israel would make Song look like he didn't belong in the octagon with him, because he would knock out Song just 1 minute into the first round. Israel was finishing everybody. So he would fight again a month later in September of that same year, this time fighting Mawai Tugamala. This fight wouldn't end as fast as his previous ones, but he would still get the finish in the second round. Israel was looking unstoppable, so he would fight again just 2 weeks later, this time fighting Gele King. And Israel would not disappoint, knocking Gele out in the second round. Israel would take the rest of the year off and focus on his craft, and improve at incorporating his striking game into MMA. In January of 2016, he would fight again when he would face off with Vladimir Kadikin. This was a one-sided fight, eventually ending in a doctor stoppage, awarding Israel with a TKO in the second round. Israel would jump right back into training camp and fight again in March, this time fighting Dabir Zarigov. Once again, Israel would continue his finishing streak, knocking Zagarov out in the second round. Just 2 months later, he would make that walk again, facing off with Andrew Flores Smith. He would beat Smith from pillar to post, forcing Smith's corner to throw in the towel in between rounds 1 and 2. Just 2 weeks later, he would fight again, this time going up against Murad Karamagomedov. You wouldn't guess how Israel won this fight. That's right, Israel would knock out Murad in the second round. Israel would take the rest of the year off and enjoy his success and further improve his game, as well as ponder what avenue to take as far as promotions. So, he would stay close to home and fight in the AFC, also known as the Australian Fighting Championship. He would get the opportunity to face a former UFC fighter and at one point a fan favorite, Melvin Guillard. He would fight Marvin in July of 2017, and Israel would end up making short work of the veteran and knock him out in the first round. Israel would make that well-known walk once again in November of that same year, this time in the Hex Fight series, this time fighting Stuart Dare. And once again, Dare would be no match for the stylebender, because he would connect shin to chin and flatline Dare in the first round. Israel had an unreal amount of hype at this point, and the UFC would take notice. So they signed Israel and would see how good he really was. In February of 2018, Israel would make his highly anticipated UFC debut, fighting Rob Wilkinson. Wilkinson showcased his toughness, but he would eventually take too much damage and the ref would be forced to step in, and Israel continuing his finishing streak, as well as his undefeated streak in the UFC. A few months later, Israel would fight an Italian fan favorite with one of the best chins the UFC has ever seen, the Italian Dream, Marvin Vettori. This would be a very hard fight for both men. Marvin would put on a good performance, but Israel landed the better shots as well as showed fantastic takedown defense. But at the end of the fight, Israel won by split decision, making his first fight to see the judges, or making this his first fight to see the judges. Israel would fight a ranked fighter just 3 months later. This fighter would be an extremely experienced fighter in the main event, Brad Tavares. Tavares would also be a very durable fighter, but Israel showed the fans his cardio and how good his defense was, as well as his counters. This scrap would go all 5 rounds, and Israel was awarded the unanimous decision. Israel had an insane amount of hype as far as more fans. Israel had an insane amount of hype as more and more fans had seen his highlights and noticed his insane combat sports resume, so the UFC would continue to push him. And in November of 2018, Israel would face a very good grappler, Derek Brunson. This was his hardest fight on paper, but in classic Israel fashion, he would counter the daylights out of Brunson and would land a picture-perfect knee while Brunson shot for a sloppy takedown. This would send Brunson stumbling into the cage, and Israel would hit him with a few more shots, forcing the ref to step in, and in the first round, Israel would get the knockout. With all the momentum and hype on his side, he would fight a Hall of Famer and one of the best middleweight champions of all time, Anderson Silva. Both warriors showed a ton of respect, spoke about how this was a proverbial passing of the torch. And it would turn out to be just that, because Israel would beat Silva by unanimous decision. And they both showed a ton of respect after the fight as well. With Israel's dream fight out of the way, he would finally get the opportunity to fight for the interim belt against another fan favorite, Kelvin Gastelum. This would turn out to be one of the best fights of all time, with Israel getting rocked extremely bad and almost getting knocked out, but he would regroup entering the 5th round, with most scorecards having it 2 rounds for Israel and 2 rounds for Gastelum. And in the 5th round, he would dominate a very tired Gastelum, raining ground and pound shots until the final bell. Israel had won by unanimous decision and became the interim champion. In October of 2019, Israel would fight for the undisputed champion. In October of 2019, Israel would fight for the undisputed belt, with his opponent being Robert the Reaper Whittaker, and Israel would make short and easy work of Whittaker, getting the undisputed championship belt wrapped around his waist. He would take the rest of the year off to recover, and in March of 2020, Israel would fight a freak of nature, Yoel Romero. This was a fight all the fans wanted to see, but unfortunately the fight would be one of the most boring fights of all time, with both men barely throwing shots and waiting for the opportunity to counter. But Israel had done enough to get the unanimous decision, getting his first title defense. So in September of 2020, he would fight against his biggest rival, Paulo Costa. This would not disappoint because Israel would remind the fans why he was the best in the division, knocking Paulo out cold in the 2nd round. With Israel's stardom and how active he was since entering the promotion, the UFC would give him the opportunity to become a double champ, fighting the light heavyweight champion Jan Blachowicz. And in March of 2021, he would have that shot. But Jan was a very big and very strong man, outmuscling Israel and taking him down time and time again. Eventually, the fight would end with Israel on the wrong end of a unanimous decision, making this his first loss. But this was just his first loss in MMA. Israel had lost in kickboxing and boxing, so this wasn't a shock for him. There was one of his former opponents making his come up as well, the Italian Dream, Marvin Vettori. This was another huge fight because Marvin was as tough as they come. They would fight in June of 2021, and this would be a hard fight, but a dominant fight for Israel, beating Marvin by unanimous decision. Israel was quickly becoming one of the best middleweight champions the UFC has seen since Anderson Silva, and he would get a rematch with Robert Whittaker in February of 2022. This wouldn't be as easy of a win like the last time they fought. It would be a back and forth fight, with some fans feeling like Robert did enough to win, but the judges saw it differently, awarding Israel with a unanimous decision. Israel would continue to be very active and fight again just a few months later in July of that same year, this time getting a fresh matchup with Jared Cannonier. This was a fun matchup on paper, but the fight did not go that way. It was one-sided, with Israel beating Cannonier by unanimous decision. Israel was on a crazy pace. In just 2 years, he had 8 title fights and defended his belt 5 times. But there was a killer in the shadows, one of Israel's very first rivals in kickboxing, and that man was Alex Poatan Pereira. In the past, Israel had lost to Alex 2 times, getting knocked out once and losing by decision. This was an extremely hyped up fight, and it would not disappoint. And in November of 2022, Israel would attempt to settle the score. At the beginning, Israel was on pace to do just that, until Alex hit Israel with a huge shot, sending him into the fence. Alex would then pounce on the opportunity and continued to land big shots until the ref stepped in to stop the fight. Israel had been finished for the first time in MMA and had taken his first loss at middleweight. But again, Israel got knocked out in kickboxing, so this wasn't his first rodeo. Israel would attempt to get his belt back in April of 2023, having his 4th fight with Alex in his career. This was his 2nd fight against Alex in MMA, so this was one of the most hyped fights of the year. And Israel would finally get redemption, beating Alex in the 2nd round after pretending to be hurt worse than he was, sending Alex to go for the finish, and Israel would counter with a huge shot, this time knocking Alex out cold, and getting the win he wanted most, righting the losses that had been haunting him his entire career. Many wanted Israel to give Alex another title shot, but Alex wanted to move up to light heavyweight because making weight for middleweight was very hard to do. So instead of fighting Alex, Israel would fight Dricus Du Plessis, but Dricus got injured and pulled out, and Sean Strickland would step in. Everyone thought Strickland would get beaten badly by Israel, but this is the sport of MMA, and at the end of the day, it is a fight, and Strickland would remind everyone of that. After dropping Israel with a strong straight punch, continuing to dominate after, he would shock the world and claim the belt. Israel had lost his belt 2 times now, and he wanted some time off to spend with his family and enjoy the fruits of his labor. So he would take the rest of 2023 off, with most of 2024, the longest layoff in his combat sports career. While Israel was relaxing and enjoying his break, Sean had fought Dricus Du Plessis, and Sean had been dethroned. Now Dricus is champion, and Israel is the contender, the opposite of how their first fight was supposed to be. And that brings us to this weekend. Israel will attempt to get his belt back and prove to the world that he is still the best middleweight in the world. Dricus is going to attempt to prove that he is the best. It goes without saying that this fight is massive for both men, with their African roots being questioned and tested, and the bad blood has been brewing for years at this point. Israel's MMA record stands at 24 wins and 3 losses. He had 16 knockout wins and 8 decision wins. He has been knocked out 1 time in MMA and has lost 2 decisions. That leaves him with a good 67% finishing rate, all of them being knockouts. Overall, either man can get the win. Dricus is a very strong and very powerful fighter who can push the pace and get Israel on his back. But Israel is one of the best kickboxers and counter-strikers the UFC has ever seen. And I think that if Israel used his time off properly to not only recover physically, but recharge his batteries mentally, then Israel can get the knockout, or at least win by decision. Dricus is a legitimate fighter who can knock you out with a few clean shots, and that's what makes this fight so interesting. I'm leaning towards Adesanya, but I wouldn't be surprised if the miles on Israel's body finally catch up with him. I'd love to see how you guys think this fight will end, so comment below. If you watched the video this far, power slap that like button and subscribe, as it is the only way to support the channel. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Have a great week and enjoy the fights this weekend. Bye.